Welcome to week 21's lecture, Dorset and Small Tools. So in today's lecture, we're going to shift our attention to the Canadian Arctic and Greenland, and we're going to focus in on stage 3 from the Alaska timeline that we talked about in the last lecture. So stage 3 is roughly 25,000 to 19,000 BCE. So remember that stage 1 started roughly about 26,000 years ago, or 26,000 BCE to about 5,000 BCE. That looked at Paleo-Indians, also called American Paleo-Arctic tradition. Then stage 2, which was roughly 5,000 to 2,500 BCE, and that looked at the Northern Archaic tradition. In stage 3, 2,500 to 1,900 BCE, we see the arrival in Arctic North America of a completely new wave of immigrants from Siberia. And these immigrants differ dramatically than people who had previously come before from Siberia, and also people who had lived in Beringia. So this stage 3 group of brand new immigrants are referred to by anthropologists as Paleo-Eskimos, also known as the Arctic Small Tool Tradition, or ASTT. So these are the people that eventually evolved into Dorset culture in Canada and Greenland. And I did talk about Paleo-Eskimos and ASTT in Alaska in the last lecture. So this lecture, focusing in on Canada and Greenland, is divided up into 4 sections. The first section is environments and technologies. The second section is the high Arctic and independence people. The third section is low Arctic migrations. And the fourth section is the Dorset and cold water adaptations. Section 1, environments and technologies. It's worthwhile to spend some time talking about Arctic geography before we get into talking about the people who live there. So the Arctic is 14.5 million square kilometers, or 5.5 million square miles, and it's almost exactly the same size as Antarctica. It consists primarily of the ice-covered Arctic Ocean and then the surrounding lands around the ocean. These include all of Greenland and Spitsbergen, which is an island north of Norway. It also includes the northern parts of Alaska, Canada, Norway, and Russia. So its boundary is defined in a variety of ways. Some define it by the northern stands of trees on land, which is known as the tree line, or by the line of the average July temperature of 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Or it's divided by the Arctic Circle, which is an imaginary line of latitude located at 66 degrees and 33 minutes north. So north of this line, that's where the sun never sets on the summer solstice. So remember we talked about polar days and polar nights in the last lecture. North of the Arctic Circle is where the sun never sets in the summer and it never rises in the winter. So there's just one long polar day and one long polar night per year. So it makes sense to think of the Arctic from a top-down model. So I want to give you a bird's eye view of the North Pole. At the center of the Arctic is the Arctic Ocean, and it's covered by ice year-round. And there's at least 6 different nation states that have a presence in the Arctic's coldest parts. And that's Canada, the United States, in Alaska, Russia, Norway, especially with Spitsbergen, Iceland, and Denmark. Denmark actually claims Greenland, even though Greenland has proclaimed its own independence. So if we measure by latitude, Iceland actually falls outside the Arctic Circle, but Finland and Sweden, actually parts of them fall inside the Arctic Circle. Also, another way that people measure this is the position of the magnetic north. And this is not a fixed point, but it shifts over time, and it depends on the Earth's axial tilt. In Canada, one of the biggest chunks of land found in the Arctic is called the Northwest Territories. And this was created as a territory in Canada in 1870. And that's when the British company, the Hudson's Bay Company, transferred all of its land to Canada. So it included all the land that was not part of a province. So provinces were created, and then the current boundary of the Northwest Territories grew and was actually like whittled away as the provinces were created. But this territory had always excluded the Arctic islands, except for the southern half of Baffin Island. And Britain actually retained control of the Arctic islands until 1880. So in 1896, the territory of Yukon was created in Canada. And in 1912, it affirmed its boundaries between itself and the Northwest Territories. So Canada finally claimed sovereignty over large parts of the Arctic in 1925, and their claims extended all the way to the North Pole. And then in more recent times, Nunavut was created as an Inuit-run trilingual territory in 1999, and it was part of a large land claim. And Nunavut means our land in Inuktitut. And I actually do want to spend just a moment reviewing some of the indigenous place names that I talked about in the last lecture. So remember, in Alaska, people call Inuit Eskimos, and Eskimo has come to be used as the main anthropological characterization for most Arctic people. But in Canada and Greenland, it's important to remember that the term Eskimo is a pejorative term. And in Canada and Greenland, most people use the term Inuit. So the term Inuit is actually recognized as a legal category in the Canadian Constitution. So in Inuit, we talked about Yupik, Cupit, and Inupiat as subgroups of Eskimo people or Inuit people. But let's also remind ourselves again of the other groups. So in the western part of the Northwest Territories, people call themselves Inuvialuit, and they also call the land Inuvialuit. In Nunavut, in the eastern Arctic, people either call themselves Inuit or they call themselves people of Nunavut, which is pronounced Nunavummiut. Then in the area of northern Quebec, which is actually called Nunavik instead of Nunavut, the Inuit there call themselves Nunavimmiut. So we have Nunavummiut and Nunavimmiut. And then in northern Labrador, the land is called Nunatsiavut, which means our beautiful land, and the people there call themselves Inuit. And then in Greenland, people call themselves Kalalit, and Greenland is actually called Kalalit Nunat, which is the place of the Kalalit. So the size and shape of the Arctic Ocean basin is roughly similar, again, to that of the Antarctic continent, and it's 1.5 times the size of the continental United States. The Arctic Ocean is incredibly deep, reaching more than 4,000 meters deep, or 13,000 feet, or 2.5 miles in some of its areas. It's mostly covered by pack ice, or frozen seawater, which averages between 6 and 10 feet thick. The ice drifts around the polar basin under the influence of winds and currents. So when flows collide, the ice forms a jagged line of ice chunks, and this is known as a pressure ridge. So that means if you do end up like hiking on top of the ice pack, on top of the Arctic Circle or the North Pole, you're never going to stay in one place. You're always going to be floating around as that large pack ice moves around. So the majority of the Arctic is composed of permanent ice and tundra. The permanent ice is frozen seawater, and because it's salty, it freezes below the point of fresh water, so it freezes at minus 1.8 degrees Celsius. The sea ice eventually loses its salt over time. It leaches out. There's also a lot of ice in the Arctic Ocean that's known as pancake ice. So this is sea ice that's been broken up into small round chunks that are usually 1 to 2 meters in diameter. So sea ice is different from icebergs. Icebergs are actually part of glaciers or ice shelves, and this is landlocked ice that's been built up by falling snow. And this is fresh water right from the beginning, so freshwater ice. So drift ice also floats on top of the Arctic Ocean, and it attaches itself to pack ice over time. Sea ice is made up of both saltwater ice and freshwater ice. And then the icebergs are released, obviously, from glaciers and ice shelves, and those are freshwater ice that break off and float in the saltwater ocean. The Arctic Ocean seafloor is subdivided by three great parallel mountain ranges or ridges in between Greenland and Siberia. So there's the Arctic Mid-Ocean Ridge, which is an active seafloor that's spreading in the center, and it stretches across the basin north of western Russia. We have the Pole Abyssal Plain, and this is an elongated trough of a flat seafloor. This lies between the Arctic Ridge and the Lomosov Ridge, which is an underwater mountain chain that is roughly 10,000 feet high above the Abyssal Plain. So on the Canadian side of this ridge, we have another abyssal plain, which forms a deep irregular basin between the Lomosov and the Alpha Ridges. So between Canada and the Alpha Ridges lies the largest of the Arctic subbasins, and this is the Canadian abyssal plain, which is a sweeping broad area with an average depth of about a little less than 4,000 meters, or 12,000 feet. So much of the Arctic land is made up of lowlands, and it's actually the wettest part of Canada in the lowlands are. And it's a very marshy place because large parts of it are on top of the Canadian Shield, so there's no drainage. And it's really only possible to travel over these marshy lowlands in the winter when the ground is frozen. So in the summer, when the top layer of the soil melts, it's just really one giant marsh. Okay, the tundra is a biome or a landscape where trees really cannot grow because it's too cold. But there is a lot of vegetation, especially in the lower Arctic, and it's composed of dwarf shrubs and sedges and grasses, as well as mosses and lichens. You might find the occasional tree or a clump of trees at the southern reaches. And the tundra can be incredibly beautiful. The lichens and mosses actually can be quite spectacular colors. Okay, so let's take a look at the tree line in Canada. We can see that the tundra actually covers a large swath of the north in Canada. And the tree line is not a neat and clean division, and it doesn't measure up at all with the lines of latitude. So it's more of a transition zone where trees start to get smaller and fewer, and it really dips down low around Hudson Bay. So underneath the tree line and also underneath most of the tundra is permafrost, which we talked about last week. And this is permanently frozen soil, sediment, or rock. And its classification is based solely on temperature, not on moisture or ground cover. So the ground must remain at or below 0 degrees Celsius for at least 2 years for it to be considered permafrost. So new permafrost is forming all the time, but some permafrost is actually thousands of years old. So, for example, some of the permafrost in Western Canada's boreal peatlands has been there at least since the 1600s. So you can imagine it's an archaeologist's, best dream ever. So permafrost has a number of layers, of which frozen ground is just one portion. There's an active layer at the top that's seasonally frozen. And then talc is the unfrozen ground that lies below the active layer and the layer of permafrost. So much of the permafrost is actually hidden by snow for most of the year, especially the farther north one moves. And average winter temperatures in the Arctic can be as low as minus 40 degrees Celsius, which is close to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And the coldest recorded temperature in Canada is minus 68 degrees Celsius or minus 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The coastal Arctic climates are moderated by oceanic influences, generally having warmer temperatures and heavier snowfalls than the colder and drier interior areas. So all this freezing and melting of the ground in the Arctic and the subarctic regions has created an enormous amount of heaving and rupture on the ground. So you tend to find the ground rough and broken up. The land in Arctic Canada is comprised of many small islands which form an archipelago. And for most of the year, these islands are locked together by sea ice, the frozen water merging into the snow-covered land. In the short summer periods, you do see open sea, but it's usually choked with pieces of sea ice and it's very difficult to cross. The most conspicuous boundary in the Arctic archipelago is something called Parry Channel, And this is a major passageway that joins Baffin Island in the east with the Arctic Ocean in the west. And the various bodies of water that make up this channel, like Lancaster Sound, Barrow Strait, Viscount Melville Sound, and McClue Strait, they're over 50 kilometers wide at their narrowest part. So the channel is found approximately at the 75th parallel, and this channel, the Parry Channel, really serves as a marker between the low Arctic islands and the high Arctic islands. So the low Arctic islands, which include Baffin Island, resemble more mainland Arctic with a fair degree of lichen coverage in the brief summers. But the high Arctic islands actually look quite different. They're really a land of gravel, rock, and ice. Along the western rim, the low gray islands in the high Arctic barely emerge from the surrounding sea ice. And then in contrast, the eastern end of the high Arctic islands contain the highest North American mountains east of the Rockies. And these mountains are the Arctic Cordillera, which are capped by enormous ice fields. So glaciers flow down the valleys and they launch icebergs into the surrounding sea. The adjacent part of northern Greenland is isolated from the southern part of Greenland by inland ice. But northern Greenland is actually only separated from the high Arctic in Canada by one small, narrow, and frozen strait. So northern Greenland seems more of the same ecological zone as the high Arctic of Canada. The climate of the high Arctic is characterized as an Arctic desert, so it's incredibly dry. It's mostly shaped by the polar days and nights. It has very little vegetation and very few animals can manage to live there. But the low Arctic lands, by contrast, are actually very lush, and they're covered by vegetation, and a lot of animals live on them. So it's a really rich ecological environment. So it is surprising to know, though, that the high Arctic actually supports a surprising number of grazing animals. But of course, there are many more grazing animals found in the low Arctic. So in the high Arctic, the primary animal is the muskoxen. And then all over the Arctic, you have many herbivores. Large animals such as caribou, grazing animals, and of course muskoxen, but smaller herbivores as well, like the Arctic hare and lemmings. The biggest predator is for these herbivores is mainly the Arctic fox and the Arctic wolf. The polar bear is also the major predator, but it prefers to hunt for marine life from the ice. Other land animals include wolverines, ermines, and Arctic ground squirrels. There are also many birds and marine mammals like seals, walruses, baleen whales, narwhals, killer whales or orcas, and of course beluga whales. Let's turn our attention now to people. So as far as the archaeological record has revealed, the first people to arrive in Canada's Arctic and in Greenland have been quite recent, really only in the last 5,000 years, so 3000 BCE. And these people came from Alaska and then originally came from eastern Siberia, which we learned from our last lecture seems to be a factory for producing new cultures every several hundred years. So these first people are unrelated to the current residents of the Arctic. And these first people appear to have left no descendants whatsoever. They're referred to by scholars as Paleo-Eskimos. So scholars unfortunately cannot use oral traditions or upstreaming to try to understand these people, but instead they rely solely on archaeology to study their culture and history. So because the climate is so cold and dry, especially in the high Arctic, it's actually very easy to do archaeology in the north, especially in the high north. The geological processes which shape landscape work at much slower rates in the Arctic than other parts of the globe. Hence, they change the landscape more slowly. So for most of the year, the land is locked in ice, and the light summer rainfall rarely produces the torrents of waters or even floods which erode archaeological sites in many other places and wash away artifacts. So it's helpful to see that this landscape that we see today in the Arctic is very similar to the landscape that ancient people would have lived on and inhabited. In addition to slow geological processes, the Arctic also has very slow biological processes. There are no forests to hide archaeological sites, and there are no soil acids to dissolve wood, fiber, and animal hides, bone artifacts, antler, and ivory. And these items deteriorate on their own very slowly in a cold and dry environment. So many archaeological sites and artifacts can simply be found by walking around and looking at the ground, just scanning the landscape. And these artifacts are almost perfectly preserved in many cases. So the Arctic is often thought of by archaeologists as like one big freezer full of archaeological sources. The freeze-dried artifacts deteriorate very slowly during the short, cool, and dry summers. So some of the artifacts do become buried under wind-blown silt or through the collapse of a wall house made of turf. But then actually the artifact gets perfectly preserved in the permafrost. So archaeologists are very happy to go digging around in the permafrost to see what they can find. So archaeologists have actually managed to find incredibly delicate items in permafrost, which include clothing made from animal skins and sewn with sinew. So archaeologists working in the Arctic are lucky for another reason. So some cultures, like the Dene people we studied last week in Alaska, take pride in living very lightly on the land and altering the landscape very little. So all the materials they need could be found in abundance around them. So they rarely invested energy in making specialized toolkits that stand out in the landscape. So this is a kind of a nightmare for archaeologists because it means they leave very few artifacts or material traces behind. But in contrast, early Arctic people or Paleo Eskimos made many tools to survive the Arctic environment. And their tools were often made with rare materials that were highly cherished, like a bit of driftwood, a hardy and indestructible animal products like bone, ivory, antler, and horn. So these relatively hard organic materials were difficult to work with, and they required a specialized technology of stone cutting tools. So the creation of an ivory or antler tool required considerable skill and effort. That meant that the tools were made by those who had developed skills over time, and the tools were probably carefully cherished. These precious tools would then also be marked with design and shaped by the particular style of the maker as a demonstration of pride in skill and in the tool itself. And we can trace differences actually among tool makers, and we can also trace the changing styles over time. Most of the artifacts made by Paleo Eskimos were so specialized that archaeologists can easily reconstruct the activities for which each tool was used: hunting, butchering and skinning animals, sewing clothing, repairing weapons, and so on. These tools then paint a rich picture of their material lives. But this meant that the Paleo Eskimos did not actually throw away their tools very often. And so archaeologists are really dependent on what people might have lost in the darkness of winter camps or the blinding brightness of snowstorms. So unlike most other foragers, especially non-affluent foragers, Paleo Eskimos took great care in transmitting their ideas about the spiritual world onto their material tools and weapons. So tiny carvings in ivory or wood portray spirit animals, the faces of human-like beings, creatures that suggest human-animal transformations, and masks used in ritual activities. But this also meant that the material possessions held great meaning for them and would not be easily discarded or traded, which makes it harder for archaeologists to find them in the ground or on the ground. So the bulk of artifacts that have been found by Paleo Eskimos are microblades, which I talked about in the last lecture. So these are primarily narrow slivers of glass-like flint with long straight edges that are as sharp as razor blades. They were made by a very specialized technique, which allowed flint workers to produce large numbers of very similar and regularly shaped tools very quickly. So these microblades could then be set into the edges of wooden or bone handles to form extremely sharp-edged knives, spearheads, sickles, and swords. I want us to pause for a moment to watch a YouTube clip of how to make microblades. So it's a video published by Mount Royal University.
I have a selection of chert pebbles. They come in different sizes and configurations, and it has an influence on your size and configuration of the core. Some cores are even made from flakes, percussion flakes. It's a very efficient means of getting a lot of cutting edge from a small piece of stone. I have with me a core. There's still a lot of usable blade material in it. All this, these flakes and core preparation debitage came from this one piece. I selected a piece of a heat-treated cathead chert from Manitoba, and I'm going to try and draw flakes, microblades from it. Essentially, there's I've made a one ridge here and another ridge here by striking off flakes with a small pebble and refining the ridge with a pressure flaker. The platform, again, has to be less than 90 degrees. Here, in this case, it's about 80, between 75 and 80 degrees. The first flakes to be removed are called ridge flakes. They are triangular in cross-section. I should mention my tools is padding for my left hand, padding to hold the little pressure flake careen. These pressure flakers can be even smaller. And I do have microblades that I removed with a pressure flaker this size. And you can see the length of these blades. Sometimes I prefer a pressure flaker that's a little bit curved, so I can direct the force into the core and along the length, so to produce a flatter microblade. Here's a obsidian microblade core. It's quite, it's almost 7 centimeters long. And to me, the distinction between micro and macro blades is more on the basis of technology. Macro blades are blades that are removed either by direct percussion or some sort of assisted pressure. And micro blades are detached by simple hand-held pressure. My objective is to remove a blade the length of the core. I have a different holding technique than Jason. I tend to use some short pressure flakers. And by this it gives me quite a good grasp of the instrument and also control of the direction that I'm forcing the pressure. Oh, this one, the material, it's one of the poorer grades of cathead chert. It tends to fracture badly. So what I'll do is switch to something that's more predictable. Like this, here's another piece of cathead chert which is higher quality. This chert comes from west central Manitoba. It outcrops in the Interlake area. One problem is occurs in places where there are no known microblade sites. But okay, now have to just. change. I'll have to switch again. If you apply too much pressure, you tend to destroy the blade, and that's what I've done here. Oh, this one broke midway, but I've succeeded in removing a fairly lengthy blade. If I refit it, it's quite narrow. You can the width of the microblade depends on the stage of reduction, the circumference of the core, and your pressure flaker. So some of the blades I've removed are, in excess of a centimeter. Some are, if you try and go for narrow ones like this, they tend to break.
Okay, and let's watch another YouTube video of a completely different method or style of making a microblade. The microblade technique was developed in Eurasia around the end of the last ice age, and these very efficient stone cutting edges were used by later Stone Age and early Bronze Age people from Europe to Japan. It's a very economical technology because it uses very little material and it is extremely portable. The microblades were often mounted on spear tips as barbs, so they increased success in hunting because one hit could cause a lot of damage to the animal, with a lot of barbs causing the damage. So the barbs would open wounds, and the resulting blood loss would kill the prey faster, and using less hunting equipment than traditional spears would. So these weapons helped increase the rate of making weapons and killing animals. The creation of microblades appears to have been an adaptation due to reduced resources that were available because of climate changes during the last glacial maximum and younger dryas. So these climate changes, which reduced resource availability, ended up producing far more efficient sustenance strategies. So in addition to making hunting faster, microblades were also effective for butchering because they were so incredibly sharp. And actually, I was trying to find a story on the internet, but I'll just tell you about a story I heard that this one archaeologist had collected his own set of flint-made micro tools, and he had to go in for cataract surgery. He brought his micro tools with him, and he got the eye doctor, the ophthalmologist, to use the flint microblades because they were much sharper than his steel implements. So, because of their style of tools, archaeologists started to call Paleo-Eskimos in the Arctic small tool tradition, or ASTT. In addition to being known for their incredibly sharp and highly portable microblades, the ASTT people were also known for their use of the bow and arrow and their finely tailored clothing, and also for living in tents. Evidence for the tents were oval rings of boulders that were used to hold down the edge of a tent. And also for box-shaped hearths built of stone slabs. The flanking of a central hearth were two parallel rows of vertically set stone slabs running from front to back of the dwelling and forming a mid-passageway roughly 40 to 80 centimeters wide. So a dwelling was then divided into three areas, a living area on either side of a central hearth. So this very distinctive structural arrangement of a dwelling was found in northern Eurasia, and it's characteristic of a traditional house used by Sami people in northern Europe. So all four of these distinctive characteristics, the small tools, the well-tailored clothing, the bows and arrows, and the distinctive houses, came with Paleo-Eskimo migrants who traveled first into Alaska and then across the northern fringe of North America. Archaeologists are quite certain that Paleo-Eskimos were not related to previous immigrants to North America, called the Paleo-Indians or American Paleo-Arctic Tradition people, or Northern Archaic. These Paleo-Eskimos are also unrelated to contemporary Inuit people. In fact, the closest living relatives seem to be in an indigenous group in Siberia called the Chukchi.